The diamond was already famous before Elizabeth Taylor ever touched it. Wealthy collectors wanted it, powerful buyers chased it, and the auction became a battlefield. But when Richard Burton learned that another man had claimed the stone, something inside him reportedly turned the purchase into a personal war. For Burton, this was no longer about buying jewelry. It had become a test of will. Elizabeth already lived in a world where ordinary gifts disappeared beneath the scale of her fame, so anything meant to impress her had to feel almost impossible. The diamond offered exactly that. It was rare, enormous, and surrounded by the kind of attention that made ownership itself a statement. Burton wanted Elizabeth to have it not simply because it was beautiful, but because losing it to another buyer felt like allowing someone else to win a contest he had already made personal. The pursuit became part romance, part pride, and part obsession. That strange mixture reflected the marriage itself. Elizabeth and Burton loved with a force that rarely looked calm. Their arguments could become legendary. Their separations could become public. Their reconciliations often carried the same excessive energy as the fights that came before them. In that world, a spectacular jewel could become more than a present. It could become an apology without words, a declaration of loyalty, or even proof that whatever chaos existed between them had not yet defeated the bond. Once the diamond became associated with Elizabeth, its meaning changed again. She was not simply wearing something valuable, she was absorbing it into her own mythology. Every appearance strengthened the connection until the stone and the woman seemed almost impossible to separate in the public imagination. That was the remarkable thing about Taylor. Historic jewels did not diminish her. Somehow, she made their histories feel like they had been waiting for her. But there was a darker contradiction underneath all that brilliance. The diamond looked permanent. Their marriage did not. The stone could survive decades without changing, while Elizabeth and Burton repeatedly moved toward emotional collapse. That contrast made every extravagant gift more fascinating. The greater the gesture became, the more people wondered what had happened behind closed doors before it appeared. Was the diamond evidence of extraordinary devotion, or did its enormous scale reveal how much reassurance their relationship constantly required? Perhaps it was both. That was what made Burton's gifts so powerful and so unsettling. They could represent love at its most generous, while also hinting at the instability beneath it. And the diamond would not remain the strangest chapter in their jewelry story. Burton was already searching for something whose value could not be measured only in size or price. Something that carried centuries of history before Elizabeth ever entered the picture. Because Burton's greatest challenge was not simply finding Elizabeth a larger diamond. It was finding something with a past dramatic enough to rival the woman wearing it. Before Elizabeth Taylor made it famous again, the pearl had already crossed centuries of power, royal ambition, and whispered intrigue. It had belonged to a world of queens and courts, yet somehow ended up at the center of one of Hollywood's wildest marriages, and its journey was almost unbelievable. La Peregrina was never just another expensive object. Its power came from age, rarity, and the weight of the lives that had touched it long before Elizabeth was born. It carried the kind of history Hollywood could imitate, but never truly create. Kings, queens, royal marriages, shifting dynasties, its story belonged to an older world where jewels could represent status, loyalty, inheritance, and political power. Then, centuries later, it reached Elizabeth Taylor, a woman whose fame had created a different kind of royalty entirely. That collision was exactly what made the gift so perfect. Burton understood that Elizabeth did not simply admire size or price. She loved stories. She was drawn to objects that had survived other lives, other relationships, other eras. Giving her La Peregrina meant giving her something no studio, director, or publicity machine could manufacture: a connection to history itself. For a woman whose own life was constantly changing, there was something almost seductive about possessing an object that had endured for centuries. Yet the pearl's most memorable chapter with Elizabeth was strangely ordinary. At one point, it disappeared. Suddenly, all that royal history and enormous value meant nothing compared with one terrifying question: where was it? The panic was immediate. A jewel connected to centuries of prestige had somehow vanished inside the disorder of everyday life, and when it was eventually discovered in a place no royal court could have imagined, the incident made the priceless pearl feel almost human. That moment revealed something important about Elizabeth's relationship with jewelry. She did not treat historic pieces as sacred objects that had to remain untouched. She lived with them. She wore them. She allowed them to enter the chaos of her private world. And with La Peregrina, she went even further. Rather than preserving it exactly as it had reached her, Elizabeth had the pearl incorporated into a far more elaborate necklace. That decision was bold. She was not simply protecting history, she was rewriting it. The pearl had belonged to royal stories before her, but now she was placing herself inside that lineage. Its past remained powerful, yet its newest identity became inseparable from hers. That was Elizabeth's gift as a collector. She could take an object already loaded with legend and somehow make its previous owners feel like the introduction. But La Peregrina represented history. Another jewel would soon represent something more intimate: the strange private language through which Burton repeatedly told Elizabeth what she meant to him. Yet the next great piece in Elizabeth's collection did not need centuries of royal history to become legendary, because its meaning came from one word Burton used again and again. Some jewels were trophies, others were romantic peace offerings, but the enormous diamond Elizabeth wore repeatedly became something more personal. She did not hide it away for ceremonial nights. She made it part of herself, and over time, the stone began to look less like jewelry and more like armor. The Krupp diamond became one of the pieces most closely tied to Elizabeth Taylor, because she refused to treat it like something too precious to touch. She wore it with confidence, repeatedly and unapologetically, until the stone seemed to lose its identity as somebody else's historic possession and become unmistakably hers. That was one of Elizabeth's defining instincts as a collector. She did not believe extraordinary jewels belonged in darkness, locked away and admired from a distance. To her, beauty was meant to be experienced. And that attitude carried a deeper message. Elizabeth lived in an era when a woman displaying too much confidence, too much wealth, too much appetite, or too much independence could quickly become a target. She knew the criticism. She heard the accusations of excess. But rather than shrinking herself to satisfy people who thought she should appear more restrained, she seemed to do the opposite. The larger the jewel, the less interested she became in apologizing for it. That made the diamond more than decoration. It became a symbol of defiance. But like so many pieces connected to Burton, it also carried contradiction. His gifts could look like proof of overwhelming devotion, yet they existed inside a relationship repeatedly shaken by arguments, separations, jealousy, and dramatic reconciliations. A diamond could arrive during a moment of passion and still remain long after the emotion behind it had changed. That permanence mattered. For Elizabeth, jewelry offered something people could not always provide. A stone did not change its mind. It did not walk away after an argument. It did not become colder overnight. Whatever chaos surrounded her, the diamond remained what it had always been: solid, brilliant, and untouched by emotional uncertainty. Every time she wore it, the mythology became stronger. Its earlier history slowly faded behind the force of her own personality. People stopped thinking first about where the stone had come from. They thought about Elizabeth. That transformation happened again and again across her collection. By then, the scale was becoming extraordinary. Diamonds sat beside emeralds, rubies, pearls, bracelets, necklaces, rings, and historic pieces whose stories reached far beyond Hollywood. Together, they were becoming a fortune almost impossible to separate from the woman who owned them. Yet the collection was also turning into something more dangerous, a physical record of relationships that might not survive. And that was the dangerous thing about Elizabeth Taylor's jewels. Marriages could end, promises could collapse, but the diamonds refused to disappear with them. Elizabeth Taylor married more than once, loved with extraordinary intensity, and endured relationships that could swing from devotion to destruction. Yet long after arguments ended and marriages collapsed, the jewelry remained. Every stone became a survivor, and some carried memories far heavier than their breathtaking price tags suggested. That was the cruel contradiction hidden inside the collection. A jewel could be purchased during a moment when love felt permanent, presented with promises that seemed impossible to break, and worn as proof that two people belonged to each other. But relationships changed. People left. Anger replaced tenderness. And still the object remained exactly where it had always been, carrying a meaning that could become more complicated with every passing year. The Burton years left the deepest marks. So many important pieces became tied to their extraordinary romance that the collection almost read like a private diary written in diamonds, pearls, and precious stones. One piece might carry the memory of a journey. Another could recall a reconciliation after a brutal fight. Another might bring back laughter, jealousy, triumph, or an apology that had once seemed powerful enough to repair everything. To the public, these were famous jewels. To Elizabeth, they could never be only that. Imagine wearing a gift from someone who once knew you intimately but no longer stood beside you. The stone could still be flawless, while the relationship behind it had fractured completely. That was where beauty became complicated. A jewel might remain dazzling, yet its emotional meaning could shift from passion to grief, from possession to memory, and eventually to something closer to survival. But Elizabeth did not allow those objects to remain trapped inside the identities of the men who had given them to her. Over time, she reclaimed them. She wore them because she loved them, not merely because they represented a husband or a marriage. That changed the balance entirely. She was becoming more than the recipient of spectacular gifts. She understood stones, settings, craftsmanship, rarity, provenance, and the strange emotional force jewelry could carry. The more she learned, the more authority she gained. What had once looked like a collection built by powerful men increasingly became Elizabeth Taylor's collection, shaped by her own taste and instinct. And its scale was becoming staggering. Behind closed doors sat diamonds, emeralds, rubies, pearls, rings, necklaces, and historic pieces whose combined value could rival mansions, yachts, perhaps even private aircraft. But the greater the fortune became, the harder one question was to avoid. Because eventually, there would come a day when Elizabeth would no longer be there to wear any of it. That question grew darker as the collection grew larger. Because Elizabeth's jewelry was no longer merely personal, it had become an inheritance problem waiting for an answer. A mansion cannot vanish into a handbag. A private jet cannot disappear into a jewelry case. But Elizabeth Taylor possessed a fortune made of objects small enough to move, sell, divide, hide, insure, inherit, or fight over. And that made her collection uniquely complicated as the years passed. That was the unsettling reality behind all the glamour. Jewelry concentrates enormous value into something small enough to hold in one hand. Yet Elizabeth's pieces carried far more than financial worth. A diamond could represent a marriage. A pearl could carry centuries of history. A necklace might hold memories of reconciliation, jealousy, celebration, or loss. By the time her collection reached its extraordinary scale, almost every important piece existed on several levels at once. Money, history, emotion, celebrity, and personal identity. That made inheritance far more complicated than simply dividing assets. Who could truly inherit a jewel the world already believed belonged to Elizabeth Taylor herself? Her children might receive an object, but they would also inherit its story. They would inherit the questions attached to it, the public fascination, and perhaps memories no auction estimate could ever measure. One person might see a priceless ring. Another might remember their mother's hand. One might see financial security. Another might see a chapter of family history too emotional to sell. Celebrity made everything heavier. In an ordinary family, a necklace can quietly pass from mother to daughter. Elizabeth's jewels had become internationally recognizable. People knew their names, their histories, the men who had given them, and the scandals surrounding them. They had crossed the line between private possessions and cultural symbols, and possessing objects of that value brought another burden. Security had to be considered. Insurance mattered. Storage mattered. Transportation mattered. Even wearing them required planning. The same pieces that represented pleasure also demanded constant protection. Luxury, at that level, came with responsibility that never really disappeared. But as Elizabeth grew older, another part of her identity began to change the meaning of the collection. Her charitable work and activism had shown that she understood wealth could serve a purpose beyond private enjoyment. That created a powerful possibility. The jewels that had begun as symbols of romance and personal pleasure might eventually become tools capable of producing something larger than memory, which meant the collection's final chapter was unlikely to be a quiet family division behind closed doors. The fortune was too famous. The stories were too powerful. And once Elizabeth was gone, the objects would have to speak without her there to control the meaning attached to them. Because when Elizabeth Taylor died, the question was no longer who had given her the jewels, it was what those jewels would become without her. Then came the moment collectors had imagined for years. Jewels seen in photographs, marriages, premieres, scandals, and private celebrations were suddenly moving toward the auction block. But bidders were not simply competing for diamonds and pearls. They were bidding for physical pieces of Elizabeth Taylor's mythology. The sale transformed everything. Objects that had once belonged to private moments were now given lot numbers, estimates, provenance notes, and bidding increments. A ring that might once have marked affection was suddenly described in financial language. A necklace connected to a marriage became a market opportunity. A pearl that had lived through centuries of history was reduced, at least temporarily, to a catalog entry and a number waiting to rise. That cold language made the moment feel almost brutal. But buyers were not really chasing gemstones alone. Elizabeth had changed the value of what she touched. Her ownership had become part of the object itself. A diamond was no longer simply rare because of its size or quality. It was rare because Elizabeth Taylor had worn it, loved it, argued while wearing it, traveled with it, and turned it into part of her public identity. The bidders understood that distinction immediately, and then the prices began climbing. Competition pushed individual pieces far beyond ordinary expectations. Each new bid seemed to confirm something collectors had known all along: celebrity history could add an almost impossible premium to an already extraordinary jewel. Numbers rose into territory that made comparisons with luxury estates, yachts, and private aircraft feel suddenly less like exaggeration and more like simple arithmetic. Yet behind every figure was another story the auction room could never fully measure. One buyer might have seen a spectacular diamond with investment value. Elizabeth had once known it as a gift. Another bidder might have admired craftsmanship. She might have remembered a reconciliation, a holiday, an argument, or a moment when the person who gave it to her still seemed permanent. That was the bittersweet truth of the sale. Money could calculate the jewel, but not the memory. As pieces passed into different hands, the collection Elizabeth had built over decades began to scatter. Jewels once united by one woman could now travel to different owners, different countries, and completely different lives. In one sense, the collection was disappearing forever, but in another sense, its legend was expanding. Each sale created new headlines. Each record price revived an old story. Each new owner inherited not only a precious object, but a fragment of Elizabeth's mythology. The collection no longer existed as one private kingdom, yet its individual pieces became more famous than ever. And beneath all those millions, a final contradiction was waiting. Elizabeth had spent much of her life being portrayed as the ultimate symbol of excess, but the last meaning of those jewels was about to challenge that image completely. And this is where the glittering story takes its most unexpected turn. Because the woman famous for owning impossible luxuries ultimately forced the world to reconsider what those luxuries were actually worth. The numbers were staggering. Individual jewels commanded fortunes, the collection became legendary, and comparisons with private jets suddenly seemed reasonable. Yet focusing only on the prices misses the most revealing part of Elizabeth Taylor's story. The diamonds became priceless because they carried something money alone could never create. At first, many of those jewels entered Elizabeth's life as gifts. They were symbols of love, desire, apology, celebration, and sometimes reconciliation. Then something changed. The longer she owned them, the less they belonged to the men who had purchased them. They became hers, not simply legally, but emotionally. She learned their histories, understood their craftsmanship, recognized their rarity, and wore them with a confidence that transformed them from extravagant presents into expressions of her own identity. That was the deeper evolution of the collection. What began as romance became independence. Richard Burton remained central to that story because his gifts carried the greatest contradiction of all. Diamonds suggested permanence. Their marriage repeatedly proved how unstable love could become. The stones survived the fights, the separations, the reconciliations, and the final endings. In that sense, they became witnesses, silent ones, but powerful. And perhaps that is why the collection told Elizabeth's life better than a simple list of films, marriages, or headlines ever could. One jewel could represent ambition, another scandal, another desire, another heartbreak. Together they formed a strange autobiography written in diamonds, emeralds, pearls, and gold. They recorded a woman who was celebrated, criticized, adored, judged, wounded, and repeatedly forced to reinvent herself. Elizabeth also understood something many collectors never did. Jewelry was meant to be worn. She did not want legendary stones to become lifeless museum pieces while she was still alive. She gave them personality by living with them, laughing in them, traveling with them, and allowing them to become part of ordinary moments as well as extraordinary ones. That is what later bidders could never truly buy. They could purchase the stone. They could own the setting. They could hold the precious metal and possess the provenance. But they could never purchase the life that had made the object famous. They could not buy the marriages, arguments, triumphs, losses, or memories embedded in the public imagination. That was the final paradox. Elizabeth Taylor owned jewels whose value could compete with mansions, yachts, and private jets. Yet their greatest worth had never been financial. It was the human history trapped inside them. Elizabeth Taylor once wore fortunes around her neck and on her hands, but in the end, the most expensive thing attached to those jewels was never the diamond itself, it was the extraordinary life that had made the world care who once wore it.